Hello and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me as we first give, I guess, condolences to the family of Mattherw Perry, who is known as Chandler on Friends. That was one of my favorite programs over the many years that the series were going on, and to his friends and colleagues who have been involved in his life over that period of time. So, this is a time for sadness and also for reflection. And for those who know what I talk about, part of the question that I have here is not only that we have lost a friend in the context of Mattherw Perry, but could they be a factor? Now, I'm very cautious about this, but I think it's important for us to address what is clearly a public concern. And I'll be detailing why I think this is very relevant and why I'm raising awareness of it. Because if these questions are not answered, they will only continue to be asked every single time something like this occurs. So there's a responsibility for us to get to the answers and reassure the public. Before I start, and I'll be going through a bit of the news and a paper about what occurs in Japan with regards to bath related deaths so that you have an understanding, as well as the potential question around myocarditis, which is always the thing at the forefront of many people's thoughts. So, if you want to join me on Thursday of this week, I'll be talking about pre pandemic weight gain and pre diabetes, focused on the insulin resistance part of the question as to why I think, based on my previous research, that insulin resistance is the driver for obesity in middle aged people who are not overeating. Clearly, overeating is the major cause, but if you're not overeating and still gaining weight, what is the physiological mechanism? And that's a bit that I'd want to share with those who are interested. So let's get back to this question. The truth is that all over social media, straight away, there has been the question, and this is what you're seeing all over the social media. And people are linking it straight away to the elephant in the room without any clear idea as to how this is connected. Now, for anyone who knows me, I always speak about the elephant in the room because it's relevant. And once you're seeing excess deaths, unusual patterns, I would suggest that it would be prudent to make sure that you are sure. And at the moment, the reality is that we don't have enough research to try and clarify some of these issues. Now, I think that the big question about myocarditis, and I dealt with this just yesterday when I looked at the fact that we're having higher deaths in the context of drug overdoses in Vancouver. And I was linking that to the fact that there is potentially a risk that people are using drugs in normal quantities for them, but they have a lower tolerance to it, and it could be related to the heart or even any other physiological changes that may have occurred. Now, specifically in relation to Mattherw Perry, there has been a history of drug and alcohol abuse. However, it's not thought that that was relevant at this time. And so I'll take you to the article that was here, that was published today. This is on Leading Britain's Conversation, LBC News. And they made a few points here that I thought were relevant in terms of the final hours around him dying. He's only 54 years old and he drowned in a jacuzzi. There are a few points that they made here that I think are quite relevant. Essentially, that he was found at about 4 p.m. This is Los Angeles time, in the jacuzzi, and at that point he was already dead. But important to note that no drugs were found at the house. He does have a well documented history of addiction, but there was a strong feeling that he was quite sober at the time. They did not think that there was any foul play, and critically, he had gone out that same afternoon with a friend playing a game called pickleball. a sport similar to tennis but played on a smaller court. He had sent his assistant out for an errand, and then he was found dead when they came home. And so that detail, that historical detail, is quite important because what it indicated is that he was technically normal in terms of his activities. He was doing strenuous exercise, playing a game like tennis, and then he went in the bathtub or the jacuzzi. And that's where the question comes in with regards to that big issue around myocarditis. Now, the recent research that had come out, and this was an important piece of research, this was, I'll show you here. I mentioned it again just before, but sex specific differences in myocardial injury incidence after the booster vaccination. And this was done just in July 2023, and they were looking at troponin levels. And critically, they found women were more affected than men. However, they were looking at about a 2.8% risk of myocarditis based on troponin levels. And that's only troponin levels, not necessarily doing echocardiograms or doing cardiac MRIs, but just troponin levels. They were seeing cases of myocarditis or suggestive of myocarditis in 1 in 35 people. That's a lot. That's a huge number of the population, especially when we think of how many people have been vaccinated. So, this is why this question is in the public arena. And this is why it's so disappointing that politicians have not conclusively addressed the question. Myocarditis is just simply inflammation of the heart, can be caused by infection, including COVID-19 infection. But the context is that they have found that there is a higher association of myocarditis after specifically mRNA booster or vaccines and boosters. Primarily, it was in the younger cohorts. But again, I have never thought we've done adequate research to look for myocarditis in the vaccinated cohort. It was never done in the same way that we looked for myocarditis in the context of severe or even mild to moderate COVID 19, as was done in the Big Ten study. So, what that means is that we have an unanswered question around myocarditis. And this is why it's relevant because there are physiological changes in the body when you go in the bathtub or in the hot tub. And if those physiological changes could trigger an arrhythmia, then that could be very relevant in the context of what we may have seen. So let's look at some research around that. This is a paper that was done in 2017, March 2017, and this was from Japan. And they were looking at bath related deaths, preventative strategies, and suggestions for general physicians. Now, they were specifically looking in Japan, and in Japan, culturally, baths are a mode of relaxation. But in Japan, they tend to use deeper baths and they take long baths. As I said here, Japanese bathtubs generally are deeper than other bathtubs in other countries, and people sit in hot water up to the shoulder level. They also like to take long baths. So it's within that context that you have the Japanese being quite interested in deaths around bathing and around the heat associated with the bathtub. A little bit lower down in that paper, they show you the age groups that are primarily involved. You can see it's just starting to rise here, 50 to 59, but the highest risk is among males. These are males here, and over 90 years old. But it does show as you get older, there seems to be a higher risk of death around the bathtub. And then when they look at the months involved, it tends to be again in the colder months of the year. This is 12 December, January, not so much in the middle of the year when it is summer periods of time. And that would make perfect sense. And that could be a factor that is relevant in the context of how people die. Now, let's go into the detail of this paper because this is then pointing out the characteristics of how patients die based on autopsy studies. So, again, you have here this is autopsy findings according to the drowning side. We're going to leave this bit out as to whether or not they have evidence of having drowned. I'm particularly interested in the characteristics of the cases. Of that 550 cases that they looked at here, you could find that 54% of them had circulatory disease, which included stenosis of the heart or heart related disease, and only 15% had disease related to the brain. So, a brain hemorrhage could also occur. Only 8.5% were non circulatory disease, and no pathological findings were found in about 36%. In that group was epilepsy, which is possible, but only 2.4%. In that group as well, we had blood ethanol levels was only found in 25%. So the majority of deaths were not necessarily clearly explained, but people, because of physiological changes in the body around the jacuzzi, because as your blood vessels vasodilate, the heart is put under more pressure initially to compensate for that, but they have found that there is a reduction in that heart rate and stroke volume over time. It's important to note that saunas and taking warm baths have been found to have generally a positive health effect. And so it's not something that we should necessarily be concerned about generally, but in the context of unexpected deaths, the question would be, could the change in temperature that occurred when he went into the jacuzzi have triggered an arrhythmia? And that arrhythmia, in that short period of time of losing consciousness, could that have been the cause of death? Now, here is the problem that we're going to find. And this is something that I think we really, really need to get clarity on. When it comes to diagnosing whether or not myocarditis is relevant, if there is not histological examination of the heart, meaning that in an autopsy, they will look at the heart and the lungs and the brain, and they may not see anything obvious in terms of looking at that person's brain or that person's heart. But without then taking a sample of it and putting it under a microscope to clearly identify if there are histological changes that could be suggestive of myocarditis, with inflammation around the blood vessels and abnormal white blood cells deposited in the heart tissue, in my view, that is not an adequate detail of this study. So it's critical for this to be done. And this has to be done because the public perception, like it or not, is highlighting the fact that we are concerned. There are a number of people that we wouldn't have expected to die. And when they are high profile, it really draws attention to this issue. It cannot be of any benefit to the system that this is not addressed. And this has always been my question. And this is again another example of where a situation has occurred, a high profile person has died, and we may find no clear evidence from autopsy, because I suspect he will have one. And if that is done without the histological analysis, I would think that this will only fuel conspiracy theories around what could be going on. So that's my principle for today. It is very sad and that we have lost another icon, somebody who was loved across the world for his work and his involvement in the entertainment industry. We've seen many of them over the past few years. There must be a responsibility to not just ignore, but to find conclusive answers that will reassure the public that there's nothing for them to be concerned about. Have a great evening.